God, as we come together on this Palm Sunday, we begin this journey of following in the footsteps of Jesus throughout this Holy Week, that you might remind in us your passionate love that offers yourself for the world, its healing and its redemption, and offers us an opportunity to follow and to be your love in the world. So we pray that you might speak to us through the scriptures that we've already read, and that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing to you, O Lord, our God. Amen. Amen. Well, I am on the heels of a fun weekend. I was up at Camp Mokuleia all weekend with some of our youth and some of the youth throughout the United Methodist Church and the Diocese of Hawaii and the Episcopal Church. We partnered together for a youth retreat up there, and we got in Friday night, and it's been a fun-filled weekend of various activities, everything from a game that I didn't know was actually a game called Run Scream, so like just literally run scream, and probably like 20 minutes down the road of playing it, my son, Hudson, says, "Is this even a game?" And then the counselor laughed at him and said, "Well, you know, it's a game, I guess, but there's no point to the game." And then they figured out that they've just been running around and screaming like little maniacs, you know what I mean? Like they just don't know what they're doing, but they're just excited. And Hudson, this is a new stage for us because Hudson, my oldest son, is 12. He's in 6th grade. And this is his first youth event, like one of his first main youth events. Because before it was all elementary school, and there's this transition from going from elementary school things to youth things. And I had the gift of being with the lower elementary school boys in their cabin overnight. And so, you know, there's all sorts of antics that are happening, and it's very interesting to see the transition with these 6th and 7th grade boys from when they're like in the cabin, you know, and all of the silliness and the stuff that they're doing, to when they're like out of the cabin and they're engaging with all the other campers, because this age is 6th to 12th grade, right? And there's some 12th graders from our friends at Kailua. You know, we have our Pacific Islander friends, and they're no little guys, right? There's some big guys. We had Sione and Charlie, who we partner with, Tongatea, on a regular basis, and they're like these big guys. And so all of a sudden you see these 6th grades and 7th grade that had all the confidence to share all the stories, right, in their cabin time, all of a sudden like shrink down just a little bit. But like on Friday, you could just tell this timidness. You know, they're just so timid. They're like, "Oh, what do I do?" There's all these big guys around because, you know, 6th graders and Kailua especially, they're like the top of the totem pole because they're in the elementary schools still in most of the schools. But there at camp, they're like, you know, the little guys. And then on Saturday, they begin to start like kind of trying out, like talking to some of them Saturday morning. And then last night, before we go to bed, they're like climbing up on top of them, like telling stories and just testing out the volume of their voice, you know? Do you remember that time in high school or whatever where you just like weren't sure if you should, you know, be the voice that says the joke or, you know, does whatever, you know, you're trying to do, or if you should just be in the background just like listening, you know? It's a difficult tension, and sometimes we step out in courage and we say a joke or we say something, or we try to be the center of attention for a moment, and all of a sudden we immediately regret it, right? Anyone remember that thing that you said that you're like, oh no? And sometimes they haunt you. I remember I ran cross country in high school, and it was my sophomore year. And it was right at the time when the song "Who Let the Dogs Out," you know that song? Woof, woof, woof. You know, it still comes on every once in a while at like weddings, and you know, like some of us are like, "Oh, I remember this song." We were the Huskies, like it was the name of our high school team, and so we're like dogs. And like I was like, okay, I'm gonna tell this joke, and I said like, "Who let the dogs out?" And then I named my like coach's name. His name was Chatelaine, and we called him Chats, and so we'd go Chats, 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 and like I thought it was funny, but apparently it wasn't, and it like stuck with me the rest of that year, and then the rest of the year afterwards, and they would like repeat that joke to me, and I was like, oh no, like that. I was reminded over and over again of that one time when I just should have what? Been silent, right? Should have been silent. And you know, like there's this tension in adolescence trying to figure out your voice and trying to figure out when and where to say it and how to say it. But circa like 25 years here or whatever it is that since I was that age, I noticed that like that tension of when to voice and when not to voice actually doesn't go away, does it? You know, there's this times when we just wonder, like, is now the time when I say something, or is now the time when I remain silent? I remain silent. And it's an art, it's an art. I find myself, I'm a verbal processor, so I have to remind myself on a regular basis that, hey, perhaps I should be like someone else in the room that just doesn't say anything for a while and just listens to everything that happens instead of kind of, gets the entire meeting in a tizzy of what we're doing. And now in our era of social media and the news being so monetized, right? Like everything is about these big headlines. Can you catch the attention of all the people with the one little blip that you're going to read or the 5-second reel that you have on the social media? And so now I think more than ever, people are throwing their voices out there as if they just want to make it heard as loud as they can, but they don't necessarily pause for a minute and ask themselves, is now the time that I should be saying all these things? And is this the right thing to say? Throughout this series of Lent, we've been talking about the in-between and how we find ourselves not necessarily either or, but find ourselves on the in-between. We looked at some characters like Mary and Martha, and if you don't know the story of Mary and Martha, Mary sits at Jesus' feet and just listens to him and takes everything in that he's saying, and Martha's the one in the kitchen doing all this stuff, and we talked about the tension of both, and sometimes we might be on this side of the pendulum, and sometimes we might be on this side of the pendulum, and Jesus is really calling us to the middle. At camp, I was talking to an Episcopal priest, and she's from the island of Kauai, and she was asking us about our congregation. And I always get kind of awkward because, a lot of the Episcopal priests on island, they all wear collars, right? They got their collars on, and even if it's an aloha shirt, they still got their collars. And I'm and then it took her until lunchtime on Saturday to realize I was a pastor, right? And she didn't even know, even though it said Pastor Brian, but I don't have a collar on. And I'm I feel anxious, oh, should I be one or the other? And then all of a sudden, we were talking later on in the night, she asked me about our church and asked me about my leadership, and she says, oh, so are you liturgical or are you non-liturgical? And I'm well, I think I find myself in between. I've worshiped at a church, I've led a church in downtown Chapel Hill that was really liturgical, and I found myself pushing them to kind of, break out of the rhythm sometimes. And then I've found myself at other churches that didn't really have any understanding of prayer of confession or passing the peace or some of these liturgical elements, and find them recognizing the value. Because that in-between has value, doesn't it? And normally when I read Palm Sunday, I can't help but think about all the excitement and the shouts of joy and the praise of Palm Sunday. But this morning I wonder just for a minute if there's a pendulum there that needed to happen. See, because the thing is that all the disciples and everyone's really excited in this story, and at the same time Jesus is really quiet and actually starkly opposite from everyone else that's there. Because usually nowadays, especially, you expect the one who's the leader coming in to be the one with all the bright ideas, all the ones who's saying all those headliners. And instead it's the disciples and the followers that are saying, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. And they're ready to proclaim the good news. Although, as we lead into Holy Week, I'm still reminded, lingering in the back of my mind, that Ash Wednesday service still happened. Where we took the ashes and we put them on our foreheads and we said, from dust you were made and dust you shall return. And one of the songs that we sing during Ash Wednesday is a psalm called Sunday's Palms Are Wednesday's Ashes. Wednesday's Ashes. And we sing that song because liturgically, if you follow the church calendar and some of the history of the church, the Palm Sunday palms, we would gather all of these palms and we'd leave them perhaps in a room of the church, and we would let them dry up over the course of the year. And then on Ash Wednesday, when we begin the cycle of journeying towards this day again, we would burn those palms and then we would place them on our foreheads. And it's this perpetual cycle of remembering these hopes and expectations that we have ultimately come crashing down at some level. And some of us, we even did that on Sunday morning. We invited people to write down some hopes and expectations that they have, and we took those and we threw them in, or actually we did it on Fat Tuesday. Sorry, we did it on Fat Tuesday, the day before. And we took hopes and expectations and we put them in this basket. And then when I burned the palms, we put them in. And we put them in remembering that sometimes what we expect to happen doesn't always come to fruition. And I'm reminded of that because, these loud, jubilant voices of the disciples ultimately are completely wrong at some level. The people that are so quick to put the headliners out there, they actually, I think, are missing the point. And Jesus, throughout the rest of the week, kind of shows them a different way. Because, I remind us on this Sunday, it's a regular pattern that we do of Palm Sunday, that there's a dual parade going on during this time. Some of you might have listened to the news and been hearing about the preparation for Passover, and I remember hearing about one family who's setting an empty chair for a loved one this year because it's the second year of celebrating Passover with their loved one still a hostage to Hamas. Because right now, the people of Israel are preparing for this Holy Week, this celebratory time, and it's a time when families would gather from afar and they would sit together at tables. They would come together to celebrate this Passover meal, this time when they remembered that the Spirit of God passed over the households that had the lamb's blood on their house as they were in bondage in Egypt. And it passed over them, and that was the pinnacle, the final straw for Pharaoh that allowed them to be freed from slavery in Egypt. And it's a celebratory time for all the people of Israel. And during that time, during Jesus' time, it was even more so. People gathered from all over the place to Jerusalem, to the epicenter of where everything was going to happen. And so as they're preparing for the Passover, you can see people coming into the villages and families preparing the tables, almost like we do for Christmas when family comes home for the holidays. But the Roman Empire knows this, and when people gather, they know that quarreling might arise, and so they too prepare for everything that's going to happen, and they double down on the efforts to show the people of Israel that who is truly in power. There's some depictions, as terrible as it sounds, but knowing that it's Passover, some of the worst emperors, they would crucify people all throughout the primary roads that were headed into Jerusalem, so that as they're going to remember that they were being freed, they remember what? That they were still under the power of this regime. This terrible, powerful regime that didn't always treat people fairly. And so at the same time that Jesus has this depiction of the parade into town, on the other side of town, the regalia of the Roman regime was coming in with all the power and all the might of the Roman Empire. And you can just imagine the chariots and the horses and the spears and the shoulders, think Gladiator or, whatever movie it is in your mind, and they're marching in. And the various politicians that lived in the villas along the wineries or out on the ocean side near Jericho would come into the city during that time. Pontius Pilate made his way in to show the people the power. And I wager to say that most of the people that were waving the palms and so excited about Jesus coming in were people that were expecting Jesus to start a war. Seriously. They were expecting the Messiah to be the one that was to overthrow the empire. And so they were quick to jump on the bandwagon and to wave their palms in the air and say, Jesus is the King, the Messiah coming into town. And as they're excited and as the rally's going, I can't help but recognize the silence of Jesus. The silence of Jesus. That Jesus doesn't necessarily join in with all of them. Although he does say later on that all of creation will protest against everything that's going on. See, I think that one of the temptations that we have right now is to be so quick to use our voices. And, to post something on social media that we disagree with and to say, hey, look, this is the problem that's going on. Hey, this is what we need to do, and this is what we need to change. And we're so quick to do that, and yet Jesus is so quick to be the example of the change that needs to happen in the world. And he doesn't start big with the billboards, he starts instead small. And one might argue, although he starts small, the impact of what he did was all the more greater. See, because throughout this week, Jesus actually strips himself almost of everything that was expected on Palm Sunday, of all the pushback against the Roman Empire, of all the fights, of all the things that was going to happen. Jesus strips himself of that. He lets go of those things, and he goes into Jerusalem, and he doesn't fight back. And instead, on Holy Thursday, when they gather in prayer and Jesus is betrayed by Judas, one of the disciples, Peter, grabs a sword and fights back against the Roman Empire. And Jesus says, "What are you doing? This isn't what I'm about." And in the same way, he had opportunity after opportunity to change the course. Even on Good Friday, when we'll be gathering together at 6 p.m. at Christ Church Uniting, we'll remember words that, like, if you are the Son of God, take yourself down from the cross. And he could have. He could have taken himself down from the cross. But instead, he does what? Offers himself. And then that Last Supper with the disciples, he breaks bread and he hands it to his disciples and he pours out a cup and he gives it to them. He says, "This is my body, which is broken for you." And in that moment, Palm Sunday is flipped up on its head. All the expectations of power and might that everyone had that waved their palms was laid down on the ground. And instead, Jesus shows them a different way. It's a theologian, John Howard Yoder, calls it subversive revolution. Subversive revolution. That at the same time, recognizing the powers that be, he lives it differently here and now, and he offers an example of giving himself to others around. And so I wonder, as tempting as it is to, get aggressive on social media or to call out your friend for thinking this way or that way or to do whatever, just kind of like those adolescents that are working out their voice, right? How much more valuable is it for them to just live out who they are, to live out the example amongst their peers? Because we all know, as we learned in high school, it's not necessarily about that one laugh that we got, that one comment that we made, the one wisecrack that we had. But it's about that consistent service to those around us. The love, the showing up through the thick and the thin. Those values, those ethics that remain true to who we are and as we raise ourselves up, as we grow into adulthood. That's truly what matters, right? In the same way, God's calling each of us to live out what Jesus lives out this week, which is a self-giving for those around. To offer ourselves in service and humility. The last thing I'll share is we were gathered last night around the fire, and we were talking about what we were grateful for. There was like 65 kids and then some adults that were there, or youth, that were there, and everyone was talking about what the gratitude. And I don't know if some of you know Stu Reinhardt, who's a member here, is active, his family's active. Well, he was a chaperone throughout this weekend. He gets up and he says, "I'm just thankful," because he was with the high school guys. He's like, "I'm just thankful for all the group that gathered. I'm especially thankful for this group of fine young men that I got the privilege of meeting this week." And then he goes on to say, because we were talking about dreams this week. And we talked about Martin Luther King, and we talked about the dreams of Jacob and Joseph, and even of Mary throughout this time. And he gets up and says, "My dream for us, for each of us, is that each of us can live out the impact of just caring for those around us." Because just imagine if all of those 65 youth that went into their schools on Monday, tomorrow, and decided that they were going to provide acts of kindness. They're going to slow their speech and be silent while their peers are trying to crack the jokes that hurt each other's feelings and do all the other things, and then just wait for a moment to pause and to speak love into someone's lives. Or perhaps they're the ones that walk into 7-Eleven and look the clerk in the eyes and say thank you and greet them instead of, trying to do whatever. He said, imagine the impact that all of you can make. And that's my dream for you. And in the end, that's God's dream for us, and that's what Jesus calls us to do. Imagine the impact that can be made if we stop worrying about the headlines and instead just do the small things of giving of ourselves like Jesus does when he breaks the bread and offers it to the disciples. It's not changing all of Kailua. It's not changing the landscape of politics in America. It's not changing the problems of the world. It's literally just taking what I have to those around me and giving of myself. And in that one small step, leading to others, Jesus changes the world. And the powers that be get flipped up on top of themselves. So let us lay down our palms and offer ourselves to the world. I invite you to pray with me. God, we thank you that you lead us, not to self-glorification, not to be right, not to be the one whose voice is heard over all the others. But instead, you call us to be a people of peace, of self-giving, to give of ourselves to our neighbors, to our loved ones. And as we create senses of community and wholeness and hope, even just around us, that might become contagious. And that the power of your love working through us might change the world. Amen.